Will the Supreme Court in the Mississippi case overturn Roe v. Wade? And of course, in overturning Roe v. Wade, it would also be overturning, most likely, the Planned Parenthood v. Casey decision, which essentially sits on top of Roe v. Wade. Now, to knock those precedents out, it would be as decisive a move as the Brown decision in 1954, where the Supreme Court overturned segregation. It overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, a case from the late 19th century. The segregation precedent had lasted for over half a century, and yet the Supreme Court said there's no basis for segregation in the Constitution. This is a bad precedent, and so we need to sort of cut it out at the root. And that's really what the Supreme Court needs to do here. And here is Robert George, a professor at Princeton, longtime pro-life advocate, very smart guy, arguing that Roe will go. He writes an article, and the article ends with the line, next year, meaning early January, probably when the decision will come out, the Supreme Court will reverse Roe and Casey. Now, when you look at Robert George's logic, it is the logic of, you may say, coherent expectation. Basically, what Robert George says is, number one, the Supreme Court can't be worried about politicizing the court because Roe and Casey are classic examples of radical politicization. The Supreme Court essentially decides an issue for the whole country based upon a non-existent provision or provisions in the Constitution. There's simply no right to abortion in there, but the Supreme Court, in a sense, put it in there through interpretive legerdemain or sleight of hand. Second, says Robert George, there's no way the Supreme Court can avoid facing the issue. The Supreme Court has got to take on full on the idea that the challenge is so fundamental, and Mississippi has made it really clear that they're not trying to chip away at Roe. They're not trying to say that they want to have abortion legal in the beginning and then outlaw merely late-term abortion. Mississippi is basically saying very clearly that we're trying to outlaw abortion prior to viability. That was the kind of standard in Roe, and it makes it very clear that you can't really uphold Roe. If Roe goes up or holds up, the Mississippi law has to go down. And if you're going to sustain the Mississippi law, you have to overturn Roe, and you have to knock out the criteria of viability. Robert George goes on to say that the Supreme Court cannot make the argument that they can't do this now because they need to sort of conserve their capital. They need to build up the credibility of the court. George says, I think correctly, that the only reason to have capital, the only reason for the court to have credibility is so it can use that credibility in hard cases where a great deal is at stake, where the fundamental integrity of the Constitution is at stake. And so if the Supreme Court doesn't do this, as Robert George, they will have forfeited their own credibility. People will lose confidence in the court, and rightly so. So for these reasons, George thinks the court knows this. And they're going to step up and recognize, listen, this may seem like something that's hard to do. I frankly don't think it's all that hard to do. In fact, the example of Texas shows that we've essentially been in a non-Roe environment now for weeks without incident. No big deal. The country can live with this. It can live through this. It can decentralize the abortion decision. But I think that we have to consider that maybe the court will not do what Robert George says. Maybe they will, in some way, try to find a way to split the difference, try to find a way to, even with some torturous readings of the Constitution and readings of the precedents, to sustain Roe, to leave Roe, you may say, unmolested. And I think if that's the case, if that happens, and particularly if it happens with Barrett and Kavanaugh, the two Trump justices, signing on to it, not voting straight out to knock out Roe, it will, I think, reveal the failure of conservative legal strategy for the past 40 years. Let's say what that strategy is. For 40 years, we've relied on conservative legal organizations like the Federalist Society to vet these justices by looking at their fidelity to original intent constitutionalism, by looking at their fidelity to the idea that they're not going to impose their own political values. They're going to be neutral umpires. They're going to be adjudicators of the actual text of the Constitution. Well, all of that will be revealed to be hollow rubbish And in fact, we have to note that the left doesn't do that. The left just picks justices based on ideology. They can count for sure on how someone like Breyer is going to vote, or how someone like Eleanor Kagan is going to vote, or Sotomayor. They don't have to sort of spend their nights thinking about it. Well, how's Barrett, how's Amy Coney Barrett going to come out on this one? How's Kavanaugh? We are sort of racked by this kind of anxiety. There's no such anxiety on the left, which tells you that if we don't want the anxiety, we shouldn't pick justices this way. We should pick people who are perfectly vetted. How are you going to vote on this? How are you going to vote on that? How are you going to vote on this? Once you know exactly what they're going to do, then you pick them. Or you essentially only confirm people like senators. Pick someone like Senator Ted Cruz. Why? His public positions on these issues is known. He's got a lifetime record of it. And so you don't bring out these judges who yeah, she wrote an article 25 years ago on this. Yeah, she once showed up at a pro-life meeting, and she had she was carrying a candle. So all this tea leaf reading is put to the side, and we recognize that we're in a straight-out fight with the left. The court has, in fact, been irredeemably politicized, and our only solution in this politicized environment is not to try to somehow step outside of it, but to ride the wave ourselves.